All right, hello Honors 410 students. We're here for day 3 of the class. Things are starting to pick up a little bit in terms of the pace of what's going on in the class. Just to start off, I'm going to post in this same post, probably right beneath the video, a copy of the schedule for our collaborative writing project and when people are submitting for that. Again, there's 3 tracks, and so the first set of them is going to be due on Monday of next week. The second set will be due Wednesday, and it'll carry on from there. But so if you're in 1A, 1B, or 1C, that means that your work is up for Monday's class. Again, this was totally randomly drawn, so I hope this will work reasonably well for everyone. I'm posting it now, even though it's a little bit early, mostly just to give people a head start, or even if you're not coming up very soon, if you're towards the end of the schedule, just so you can have an eye on it and plan your work accordingly. Similarly, for the group-led discussion videos, everyone's going to be up next week for that. The first one on Monday. So again, just kind of being able to plan your work. We're going to be discussing the 2 novellas we're reading from the Joe Hill book, Strange Weather. And so again, the idea is just pay attention to things of interest to you. It can be really small details. It can be bigger picture issues. But start brainstorming. I would encourage you again not to get too committed to any specific ideas too early, because if we go over them in class, I don't want to leave you in a spot where it's being redundant. If you start talking with your group mates, again, the groups are going to be listed below. And you start to come up with some ideas of what you would like to talk about. Feel free to send me some of your notes. If I know what you're going to talk about, even if I was planning to talk about similar things, I might be able to adapt a little bit to kind of accommodate your group, or at least let you know what kind of leeway you have, so that may be helpful. But yeah, I encourage you, for those groups purposes, to read a little bit ahead, whatever's pertinent to your individual group, especially for the groups going on Monday and Tuesday. Just to make sure that you've got time to do this justice. I know it's a very fast pace for this course. It's kind of the nature of a summer session class. I expect you probably will have to do some work over the weekend, or at least late in the day Friday, to get your stuff ready for this purpose, or at least for the person doing the final editing. I imagine it's going to bleed into the weekend, assuming that you do it in such a way that it requires that kind of work. But in any event, especially for groups 1 and 2 who won't have the benefit of seeing other groups go before them, before they've really got to get working on this, feel free to touch base with me if you have questions. But I hope that the listing of groups I have below and the schedule I posted below is all pretty intuitive, makes sense to everyone. But let me know individually if you have questions. Feel free to post questions in the discussion thread if they're questions that be good for everyone to hear. And we'll try to make sure this is all clear for everyone. But rest assured, I understand this whole online format is still a little bit unusual for all of us. And on top of that, it's a fast-paced class. So as long as I can see that you're trying and you're honoring the general deadlines and working with me on this, rest assured I'm going to be pretty understanding and evaluating these things as well. And I think you'll find that it's pretty fair. And again, I hope this is fun, right? Because again, the kind of stuff we're reading in this class and the kind of assignments I'm putting on you, they're hard work, and there's no denying that. But at the same time, my intention is that they're also things that we can actually enjoy while we're learning from them. That's kind of the spirit of this course in general. So be creative, have fun with these things, and I think we're all gonna enjoy the video presentations, and this communal writing project especially I think can be a lot of fun as long as we let it be. So with all that, take a look at the schedules and the groups listed below. Let me know if you have questions. If you see yourself positioned in such a way that there's a very specific day when you just really are not going to be able to do this because you have some outside commitment or whatnot, let me know your situation. I will do my best to work with you as long as we have some lead time. If you tell me the day before you have something due that you're not going to be able to do it, that's a lot harder to work with. But if, for example, you let me know later today of a serious issue and need to reschedule, there's a good chance we can work something out, right? So please just keep me posted on that. But okay, so with all that though, I did want to go ahead and dive into our first more substantive read of the summer session. So again, this is in the Joe Hill book, Strange Weather. And the way this thing is split up, I'm sure most of you have observed at this point, it's into 4, I would call them novellas. The book itself brands them as short novels. It's sort of a synonymous term essentially. But with that, I wanted to briefly address who Joe Hill is, and I imagine some of you probably know this, but some of you might not. So he's a fairly established author at this point in his own right. He's written, I would say, primarily horror, but a lot of kind of magical kind of realism, as I would suggest some of the stories in this book are. But I think he's a really interesting author. He authored Lock and Key, which was a Netflix series that came out this past spring. He wrote the graphic novels. He had his partner. I always blank on his name, so I'm not going to try to mispronounce it or get it not quite right. But he has a partner who does the illustrations. Joe Hill does the actual writing for it. But in addition to that, he's Stephen King's son, which I think is just kind of an interesting footnote. He doesn't go by the King name because he kind of wanted to make his own way. But now they're both pretty public and acknowledge that familial relationship, which I think is just an interesting footnote given some of the shared kind of concerns they have, some of the ways you can see King kind of influence Hill for those who've read some Stephen King. So in any event, I hope that might be interesting to some of you. But okay, so to drill into the text a little bit here, I have a few specific places and items I'm going to take us to. For our discussion thread below, I welcome you to respond directly to the questions I'm raising, but also to bring in your own observations and questions and things that drew interest to you. In an in-person discussion, a little more naturally, I think the discussion kind of flows and we go to things that people are interested in, and sometimes people answer a question in a way that doesn't exactly answer the question, but actually takes us in a related, interesting direction. Those sort of tangents and kind of extensions of discussion are a little bit harder in the online written form of kind of discussion, but I hope we can still get to some of them, so please don't be shy about bringing in things of interest to you. But I want to start right at the very beginning of this thing. So this is on, let's see, page 235 here, in the very first sentence of chapter 1 here. So it says, he hated it in the back of the little plane, squished in with the others. That's the very first sentence of this thing. And it seems like a small thing to zero in on, especially for all the directions this thing ends up going in. But I think it is often really useful to look at the beginnings of stories and seeing why we start there. That's part of why we looked at that very first chapter of Harry Potter for last time. But so with this sentence that captures our main character Aubrey in the back of the little plane, squished in with the others, I want to ask why we would start here, because I think Hill knows what he's doing. I think this is a very intentional choice. Just that one sentence, what that kind of communicates to us, what kind of tone that sets, what we know about the character, what that does in terms of setting the larger scene or setting us up for the rest of the paragraph, the rest of the page, the rest of the chapter, the rest of the novella, what that does for us. The next thing I wanted to go to was so Aubrey, he's our protagonist of this story for sure. We mostly get it from his point of view. And he's referring to his jump master, the person he's attached to for this skydiving endeavor. And he says he forgot his name and he just calls him Axe. And so there's some obvious kind of superficial reasons why he chooses this nickname for him, and I think there's something that we can read into it in terms of what Axe means in this case, and what Aubrey is kind of doing mentally when he kind of processes who this jump master is. So without giving too much of my interpretation, I'll probably weigh in on the comments more on this, but I'm curious what people make of that, what kind of sense we make of it, what we think of him using that name Axe to identify the jump master. The next spot I want to go to is on page 240. This is, let's see. Let's read the last three paragraphs. So the really short ones are mostly dialogue here. So it starts, it's going that way, Aubrey said, jabbing a finger to the north. So what? Brad Morris called out. For the second time in the last few minutes, everyone was looking at Aubrey. All the other clouds are going in the opposite direction, Aubrey yelled, pointing south. It's going the wrong way. So similarly, this is the end of chapter 1, and I guess I'm circling our discussion back around to a very similar point to what we get out of the very first line of this thing. In some ways, this is sort of punctuating the very first piece of this novella, right? And so I want to ask what that's doing, that little exchange of dialogue, the fact that Aubrey is the only one who seems to notice this seemingly unusual thing. It gets a little bit diffused at the start of chapter 2 because we get an explanation for why this phenomenon might might be happening with the clouds. But nonetheless, I would argue it's a little bit foreboding, a little bit creepy. It's a little bit telling about Aubrey's character that he's the only one who notices this and calls it out. But in general, why we think this is here, what it's doing for the novella, how we kind of understand that and that choice to put it there. Okay, so there's a bunch more we could look at in terms of, especially kind of the relationship or the perceptions between Aubrey and Axe. And so if people would like to comment more on that relationship, I'd be happy for us to have that discussion a little bit more. But for the purposes of the video lecture, I wanted to jump ahead a little bit. This is to page 257. This is right sort of towards the middle of the page. It's the third full paragraph, kind of looks like kind of the fourth paragraph because one of them kind of carries over between 256 and 257. But it reads, he stared at the coat rack, wishing he could send a picture of it to Harriet. Whenever he saw something beautiful or improbable, his first impulse was to take a snap and send it to her in a text. And so this is an unusual moment. I mean, just the emergence of this coat rack in and of itself is unusual, and I'm curious, what people make of this kind of magical coat rack kind of materializing, and we get a little bit clearer context of what this might mean as the pages go on here. But all the more so the degree to which he kind of filters this through Harriet, right? Because it's not sort of just marveling at this sort of magical occurrence on his own, but rather he pretty immediately shifts gears to like his instinct to say, I would tell Harriet about this, right? Which I think is an unusual and kind of interesting quirk for this character. Okay, and I'm just going to take us to one more place for now. And again, there's so much that we're kind of skipping over here, but I hope folks will fill in the blanks with the parts they found most interesting, either in our discussion or in the reading response journals, or both, right? That's kind of what they're there for, is to drill into things that we might not be addressing as much directly in my video lecture here. But on 268, we have a big shift here where we get a flashback. And for those who are reading ahead a little bit more, you'll recognize that this is a structure that this novella follows quite a bit, where we get kind of flashbacks between different time periods. And so I guess the big question, without getting necessarily into the specifics here of, Harriet and June and Aubrey's relationship with them, why would we make this sudden transition to a flashback at this point in the novella, given what happens before it, given the current action of the story? Because obviously we could just stay up on this cloud, for lack of a better word, that Aubrey's sort of living on, and yet instead Hill takes us back in time to kind of flesh out some elements of Aubrey's relationship with Harriet and the history with June. And so I would suggest, I think that's an interesting choice, at least. And so why we think Hill is making that choice, and more broadly, kind of almost more philosophically, why we have flashbacks, right? Because it's not as though this is the only book or piece of media where this is used. It's a fairly common mechanism to use in books and movies and TV shows. And I'm just curious what the value of a flashback is, right? Because if we look at kind of, well, I would say in some ways it's the most intuitive, kind of logical, straightforward way of telling a story, it tends to be, let's just, tell the story in chronological order. That's easy to follow. And yet I don't question it as being a good tool, right? I think Hill uses it pretty well in this case. So what it's doing, why we would use it, what's the value of flashbacks in general, and then again, more specifically in this case. But on a similar note, what some of the dangers of flashbacks might be, right? Because I expect there are at least a few of you who, when you were reading this, were doing this in between doing 10 other things, or simultaneously listening to some music, or you had the TV on in the background. No judgment. I think we all do it to some extent, although I'd encourage you to focus on your reading. I think that's a good habit to get into. But nonetheless, when something like this happens, at minimum, I would suggest that it can sort of take us out of the flow or disorient us a little bit, right? Because if you weren't paying your fullest attention to this thing, or even if you were, you seem like you're reading one book and then all of a sudden you're reading a different book, right? It's happening in a very different time, a very different context, very different set of circumstances. So what the dangers of that are, and again, kind of why that gamble is or is not worth it. Because you might find that this was ultimately too disorienting in your perspective, right? And while I would personally argue that I think Hill pulls it off, I think it's a useful way of telling this particular story. And we'll get into that a lot more in our last couple sessions talking about this novella. But what's going on here, and again, what kind of gamble Hill is making? But all right, well, I'm going to stop here. For once, I've actually successfully finished at under the 20-minute mark. I'm going to leave a full 5 minutes that I'm not going to use up this time to make up for some of my longer videos in the first couple. Hopefully, this will be a little bit more standard in terms of what I do for these video lectures. But I'm really eager to hear what you all have to say in the comments below. And again, I'll look over those and respond myself. And again, as a reminder, keep up on those reading response journals as well. You don't need them for every reading, but for each reading assignment, you're able to. So if you wanted to do 3 separate journal entries about the 3 separate reading assignments from Aloft, that is a 100% fair game, so feel free to do that. All right, thanks everyone, and we'll see you tomorrow.